anthropologist, René Girard. And you know, anthropology is looking at the human story, everything that's involved with what it means to be human, whether it's psychological or sociological or how we became human, or what does it, you know, language is something that makes us unique. And this anthropologist started his journey not as a believer, but somebody that was just very interested in the human story. And some of the ideas I'm going to share with you today are ideas that completely subverted my understanding, that completely turned my faith inside out, upside down, to the extent that at some stage I thought I lost my faith. But from that place was birthed an appreciation for the depth of what we're dealing with, a new richness of understanding of the biblical story, and a new level of experience that I haven't had before. You know, we just heard that this building at one stage was used for something else. When they came here and decided we're going to make this a beautiful living space, whenever you want to restore something, it most often looks worse before it looks better. You know, you've got to get everything out, strip it bare, and then start from the basics. And this is what this story has done for me. It's a stripping bare, but at the end there's something more beautiful. So I'm going to ask you to keep the faith, even if there's like some challenging ideas coming across. Because the end result is not just destroying what we believe, but kind of building a more solid foundation for a more beautiful experience of faith. So the 3 sessions I'm dividing this into is the first session, we're going to look at the concept of desire, and very soon we're going to find out that desire is not just something that originates within yourself, but rather that your sense of self originates in the movements of desire. So it's going to kind of give a basis for our next level. So the first level may be a bit psychological, maybe a bit what it means to be human, and I'm going to start off telling it from that just a objective level. I'm not going to start off from a theological level, if that's all right. Then the second session is going to be on what I'll call the scapegoating mechanism. Now this is something, it's a process that made us human. It's a process that gave birth to civilization and to religion. It's a process from which sacrifice is born. And you know, sacrifice is quite a big thing in most religions. And if you discover what is the heart of sacrifice, that becomes a very deep critique of the very concept of religion. And then the last session, and that's where we might touch on a bit of theology, we're going to ask, so what the heck has all of this got to do with Jesus? Okay. And what has Jesus done to transform this story? And, you know, all of us have a story. You have a narrative by which you understand yourself, where you come from, what you do, where you think you're going. And most of us develop our own personal narratives based on a meta-narrative, a larger story that gives us a reference for the meaning we create. And as believers, many of us claim the scriptures as that meta-narrative. That's a story that tells us where we began and hopefully where we're going. So if we start messing with the meta-narrative, which I hope to do today, we're going to start messing with that whole idea of what is the story all about. It has very direct and specific relevance to your personal story. Because if the way in which you give meaning to your life is connected to your understanding of what Genesis says of where I began, then if we change that story, suddenly your story is being changed. But let's just start. I'm going to start off with the concept of desire. Now, there's a word that I might use often. It's the word mimetic or mimesis. And the anthropologist René Girard is famous for what is called mimetic theory. Now, he chose that word mimesis. It's the same word that Paul uses in Ephesians 5, where he says, we've translated it, imitate your father. That word imitate is the Greek word mimetis. Girard chose not to translate that word as imitate. We get the word mimic from it as well. But he wanted to emphasize that humans have this capacity to reflect and imitate others unconsciously. And because we take the word imitate, we often associate it with something conscious. He wanted to use a different word because he wanted to emphasize that unconscious part of our capacity to imitate. Now, humans are more imitative than any other creature. I mean, we've just had our first grandbaby, and we delight in every movement that looks like imitation. You know, if you coo for this little guy, and he goes, woo, bang, yeah, the world is all right, this boy is intelligent, he can imitate. You know, we learn to speak through imitation. Everything you are as a human now, even your physiology, the anthropologist that specialized in looking at how the human body developed says that our capacity to imitate is what formed us in this way, because great apes might pick up a stone and throw it. You know, they've got that ability to project an object. But thankfully, what they are not good at is repetition, to practice. Now, repetition is just a form of imitation. I see somebody do it, I'm going to continue doing it until I can throw this object accurately and hit the target. That is something unique to humans. We don't just do something once, we continue and we become proficient. So the very way in which our bodies have been formed is by this capacity that we have practiced throwing projectiles. We have practiced all these imitative things that we've, and actions that we've seen. Now, all of nature is imitative, but humans, our capacity for imitation is more complex and more intense. Studies that they've done with young children, where they, for instance, I think it was 1-year-olds, they took them, sat down a group, and they would take a toy. This is so convenient. And they would pick up a toy and they would start attempting to disassemble this toy, something that's easier to disassemble than this. But even fail at the attempt to disassemble it, then they will leave that toy with the young kids. these young kids, 1 year old, will immediately grasp the intention and try and complete what you desired to complete. That is fascinating. Now, how does that 1 year old enter your mind and perceive your desire? That's a unique human capacity. We don't just imitate actions, we imitate desires. Now, another thing they've done, then after that first experiment, they took a robot and the robot did exactly the same actions as the person did with that toy. They then left the toy with the kids, and none of the kids were interested in the toy. Why not? Because there's no desire to reflect. There's no intention to perceive. Our capacity to imitate one another's desires is what opens us up to the interiority of another person and to the interiority of God. It is a tremendous capacity to connect not just on an external level, but to somehow be able to reflect the interiority of another. And that is a capacity that humans have in a complexity and the intensity that other creatures don't. They do have it to a certain extent, but not to that extent. Now, why is this significant? It's always difficult, and you know, this is the aspect of Gerard's ideas that surprised me and caught me off guard completely, because I got into studying his ideas not because of desire. A friend kept on pestering me, you've got to read Gerard, because the way in which I would proclaim the gospel was to separate the violence that we saw in the scripture between what God intended and what humans do. But I just used like biblical principles of interpretation to say the violence is not really God, that's ours. But this friend kept on pestering me because he knew that Gerard understood how violence functions and that it would give me a much better grasp of how that operated. So it was for those theological reasons that I started reading, understanding, perceiving. But what I did not expect is how this concept of desire, it hit me at one specific period and turned me inside out. Because up to that stage, I was quite comfortable that who and what I am was designed and created by God, and that my only job was to find out how He designed me and to become it. Does that sound familiar? Suddenly, I entered into an understanding that communicated this simple idea, that I was not created only in the past, but that I'm in the process of being created. And in that process of being created, the one thing that shapes me more than anything else are my desires. But then came the shocking realization, and that was that my desires did not originate in myself. But they were reflections of the relationships I found myself in. And that's a realization that I came to unconsciously, and it was very depressing for me at first. Because I don't want other people to shape me. I don't want other people to have an influence on how I'm being created. I want to be in control. of this process. And so that was just a little detour. Let me come back to kind of make it relevant in terms of our spirituality, where we're going with this. So, have you ever seen a little precious one like that run up to a toy that another kid discovered and says, I saw it first? What happened is that this little fellow or girl saw the other toddler seeing that toy, and that is what made it obvious for this one that that is desirable. In fact, if you put a toddler in a room full of toys, he might not pay attention to anyone, and you introduce another toddler into the room, the new toddler will notice the other toddler first, because that is where there's internal connection, reflection, capacity. The next thing he will notice is the toy closest to the other toddler. He will head over to that toy, and war breaks out, because now the first toddler also realized, this is the toy I wanted. And that's a kind of short summary of human history. We don't know what we want, so we reflect the desires of others, and then we go to war to attain something that we did not even know we wanted until we saw somebody else wanting it. This is in James 3. Why is there conflict? Why is there war amongst you? Because you desire. And your desire remains unfulfilled. So Gerard started saying that the first thing that he noticed in great novels and all these psychological explorations of what makes us human is the fact that we don't really know what we want. And because we have this sense of lack of being, we very soon recognize in others the fullness we think we lack in ourselves. And when we recognize in others what we think we lack in ourselves, the next thing we recognize is, what toy does that model look at? What does that person desire? This is how all advertising works. They don't just show you the latest, nicest car. They show you the sexiest, handsomest model next to the car. Because they know you don't really care about the car. What you care about is being. You want to be that person. And if that person that embodies all the values that you think is worthwhile in this world, if that person desires that car, then obviously that's what I need. To be as full and fulfilled and satisfied as that. So advertising works on these principles. But it starts off, first of all, from our capacity to imitate, which isn't good or bad. It opens up a wider range of possibilities, both good and evil. To imitate the desires of others is both the capacity that opens us up for intimacy with others, intimacy to a deeper, more intense level than what we've experienced before, but that same capacity can also open us up to conflict, to an extent that we are more violent than most animals if placed in the right circumstances. So the thought around desire that kind of really tripped me up in the end was this idea that I was very proud of my authenticity. And to realize that part of what makes me me is my capacity to imitate. was a contrast that I wasn't immediately able to reconcile the fact that I'm both authentic and imitative. I saw a billboard once of this young girl dressed in the latest fashion, torn jeans and everything, and the sign said next to it, "No one tells me what to wear." How ironic.
Yeah.
This is the billboard that's telling all those who are feeling a certain way that your rebellion against anyone telling you what to wear, here I am telling you what to wear. And if you wear this, it's because no one tells you what to wear.
Yeah, right.
So that became for me one of the first areas of struggle. How do I reconcile authenticity with my inner imitative capacity? I remember as a young child I would go to my granddad's home, and he was an artist. He had a studio. I loved going into that studio, just smelling the paint and seeing the process of him being busy painting. And I went on to art school, and very soon I learned how it was Leonardo da Vinci that kind of said you should not imitate, that's the worst kind of artist. And so I really wanted to develop a unique style and flavor, didn't want to imitate anyone, as I studied with great interest the great artists and their techniques and how they did things, not knowing that in the very process of studying them I am imitating and reflecting their capacity. You see, what makes you authentic is not the fact that you don't imitate, but rather it's the unique combination and interpretation of the relationships you are in, the unique way in which you combine those reflections. So imitation is part of your authenticity. It's not one or the other. We want to be authentic by thinking we are drawing from a unique self that doesn't need anyone else to make me who I am. But authenticity really is welcoming the influence of the relationships you are in and combining them in a way that is unique. So desire. Let me think how I want to conclude this session before we speak about that. How is desire linked to identity? Very often, if we do not give desire our attention, we would think that desire has its origin in my unique self. But understanding the reflective nature of desire means that actually my sense of self has its origin in the relational movements that I'm in. That I'm being created. That my relationships with others are shaping me. And the thing about our relationship with others that's communicated most unconsciously is a communication of desire. The very reason you got up this morning, came here, whether you knew it or not, is because there's something in you saying there's more to my future than what's in my past. There's some unfulfilled possibilities in life, and desire emerges in that space between what is and what could be. Desire is what draws you from here to something larger. So desire can be a very good thing. Now, in the next session, we're going to kind of extrapolate that more in the negative side, which is a very positive thing. Because becoming honest with who we are and what our society is, you know, correctly diagnosing our problem is what's going to give us a new insight into what salvation is. And we're going to look at how societies were formed, how cultures were formed, and what role desire played in the formation of communities, of cultures, of religion, of violence. But I wanted to maybe just end off with that idea, and then we can have a bit of conversation around this idea of desire. That desire is a relational movement, that who and what I am is not something that was just created in the past, but it's an ongoing process. That is both good and this good news and a bit disconcerting. Because previously I could just fall back on, even though I'm confused, not knowing where I'm going, hopefully whatever God designed me to be, that is still in place. But this kind of view says a lot of your design and who you are is something that God gives you the freedom to be involved in. It's not a set design. It's not a set blueprint, a plan that this is just who you are, but rather it's a creative process that he says you can be involved in how you are created. You can be involved in what relationships you allow to shape. The end has not been determined because God is love and love is not controlling. God has got really no interest in controlling it.
Right.
We are obsessed with control.
Yeah.
I was obsessed with controlling how I'm being shaped and started being very nervous of how people are going to influence how I'm being created. But now I have this excitement that if relationship is what creates me, then every relationship is an opportunity for expression, for growth, is an opportunity to become more than what I am. So desire is very intimately connected with identity, because it tells me that my identity is not some isolated substance, but it's a dynamic movement. And this dynamic movement means that I am what I am in relationship with others, that I'm in the process of being created. And I'm going to open it up for conversation at this stage before we take it further. I think there's enough ideas for conversation there, is there? Yeah? Let's do that. I'm just going to open that up for comments, questions, however you want to take that further. Yeah.
So I find this very fascinating. I've never really connected, just kind of observing others' desires and how that shapes me. Because I was just thinking, I'm here because I desire to find out what you have to say. And also, we're just with Carlos and Beth's values. So desires can be also others' values, right? You desire what others value, just to kind of explore that and see what I can learn from that as well.
Yeah, beautiful. Because value is just a way of saying this is more desirable than that.
Yes.
That's why I value it more. It's it has a meaning that is more intense than the other possibilities. Yeah.
It kind of brings to mind for me like the verse where it says, "Be being transformed by the renewing of your mind." It just seems like it goes in line with like we are in process and we're always becoming and transforming. And,
Yes.
Yeah.
Love that. That was a big thing for me to get my mind around. I think even philosophically, there are only really two approaches when philosophers decide how do we understand the nature of reality. There are only two approaches to answer that question. The one approach, which has been predominant within Christian tradition, is what they call substance metaphysics, and that's starting with reality is made of things, and these things act, and so all activity is the result of things acting. That's the one approach. But then there's another approach that says, no, reality is activity, is processes. And everything you can observe cannot be explained without referring to the process that formed it. There's nothing that is not in process. If I have to look at this lampshade, it doesn't just exist in this moment. It has a history behind it. There's a story of, if we have to figure out where those elements came from, it's a fascinating story. And at some stage they came together, were formed into this unique form, and all of that is embodied in what we see there now. You can't look at yourself in a mirror and really think that you only exist in that moment. We can't take 5 years from your past, remove it, and you are still the same person. Every experience, every movement, every process has contributed to what and who you are now. And in that sense, the past is present. The past has been distilled. The past is not something that just passes away and the future is something coming. Rather, the past is something that accumulates. The present is the accumulation of the past. And so that approach to say that we begin with process, that then connects to that scripture that says, keep on becoming, keep on being transformed. Even if we look at the things that we think are most stable, mountains, they're all in process. Whatever mountain you can think of, there was a time when that mountain wasn't there. And although its process is very slow, it's all in process. Yeah.
So a couple of things I'm hearing is we came from the Lord, obviously God, who is the desire, who desired us. He's the desire of the nations. And then you have this energy going on, and that's why we're so drawn or connected. So you got into quantum physics here, which I'm still learning about. But this desire in terms of the positive part, which would be the Lord in terms of Him drawing us more into His desires, or us growing and realizing how great is this desire that's in the universe. And then you have, like you're going to talk about later, the negative part and how that relates to or fits in or is used by Him.
Yes. So, if I have to start, if we for a moment forget the biblical story and we say, let's look at human history. If God is the one who gave us the freedom and the opportunity for us to become and to be involved in our own creation, then inevitably there's going to be misunderstandings and wrong turns. And I think part of what the biblical story starts doing, like the Genesis 2 and 3 story, is to explore the ideas of what made us human. What is it? And it's not just the biblical stories that have those questions. Those stories were written in the context of many other myths. And all of those myths have this similar theme. They recognize that there's something about humans that we do not see in the other life forms we are in relationship with. And they call that something wisdom. Today we'll probably call it consciousness. Would be the closest idea. There's something about our intellectual capacity to be aware and conscious of self and others that's different from what we encounter somewhere else. But then so all of the myths, even extra-biblical myths, kind of say, thank you, divine beings, for blessing us with this gift called wisdom. But then their very next question is, why make us clever enough to know that we're going to die? Why not give us immortality? Why only wisdom? And so this is the theme of most of those texts, is you've blessed us with wisdom, but you haven't blessed us with immortality. What's up? Why are we in this conflicting space of trying to make sense of a capacity that is out of all proportion to our longevity? And I think that is captured within the Genesis story as well, where it says God breathed into this ball of dust. It's like there's a disproportion here. There's a part of me that's dust. There's a part of me that's just temple. And disproportionate to this embodiment is the very Spirit of God that's been blown into me. How do we make sense in that context of who we are? And so it's interesting, in the Genesis 2 and 3, one of the most important aspects that it explores there about what makes us human is the awakening of desire. And the awakening of desire in that context happens when there's a prohibition. Don't take that. It's like leaving a jar of cookies with 20 teenagers and say, I'm going out for an hour, don't touch them. And you come back and all the cookies are gone. And so this is kind of the story in Genesis 3. We can have everything, but don't touch this tree. And desire is awakened there through this whispering voice that begins with the suggestion that you don't have the fullness of being that's available to you. Why? Because God, the ultimate being, wants this tree for himself. He doesn't want you to have it. And the moment you perceive that somebody has something and doesn't want to share it with you, that awakens desire. I want that fruit more than any other fruit. Why? Because I can't have it.
Right, so I'm incomplete.
Yeah. And so it's a beautiful exploration that this is part of the process that's unique to humans. And maybe it's not just the historical story, maybe it's the story of every person growing up. All of us begin smaller, less able, less capable than those around us. Our siblings are bigger, our parents are bigger, and they are allowed to do more than we are. And they can do more than we are. And so it's very easy for a sense of insufficiency or lack to settle in. and then we want to grasp. And there's a time of confusion within children's lives where we delight in them imitating us. But then I start chopping the vegetables with a knife and they grab the knife and we say, no, don't imitate that.
Right.
You can imitate me cooing and doing this, but no imitation with the knife
Or
the fire.
Or if you're frustrated and angry,
Yes,
they'll imitate that.
don't imitate that. And maybe that is what the Genesis story is about. It's not that God did not want us to eventually partake of that knowledge of good and evil. Because it's not absolute good and evil. It speaks more about value judgments. What's better and worse. And in the New Testament, in Hebrews, that ability is extolled as something that belongs to those who are spiritually mature, those who are able to discern between what is good and evil. So it's maybe like parents saying, you can't play with the mattress now. You can't have the pocket knife now that you're 1 year old. But stick with me. I'm going to lead you into a place where I teach you how to handle this new world, this new knowledge. And part of our problem is we grasp for things before we are ready for it. And that's maybe what happens with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We grasp for that capacity because we thought we lacked it. Now, I think, coming back to your question, how do we link this up in our relationship with God? That's the third session. That's where we come to Jesus. So I'm first going to go through kind of the anthropological misconceptions, confusions, how it has shaped our communities, our societies, our culture, our religion. And then we're going to come back to Jesus saying, there's a different way of being human. This is part of your history and we can all identify with it. We've all been in a place of frustrated desire, all of those things, and how it shapes us. But there's another way of beholding the possibilities in front of you in a way that it doesn't cause you to create victims. It doesn't cause you to become protective of who you are, but it is more insight into, like Jesus said, I don't desire anything unless I see my Father desiring. For me, what that has done is it's given me such beautiful insight into conflict as well. Whenever I find myself in conflict or upset by anyone or anything, it's so easy to just say, well, I'm upset because you were stupid. Well, I'm upset because you did this. That's Genesis 3. Well, I ate the fruit because this woman that you gave me, it's like, it's not me, it's her and it's you. Well, I ate the fruit because this snake that you created, it's ultimately God's fault for setting up this situation. That capacity is to scapegoat, which is very much part of the human society and culture, but personally also. And just knowing it doesn't change it. Makes you more aware of it. But I still, sometimes I know, I was irritated with that person, not because of anything she or he did, but because I have unresolved conflicts within myself. So what this helps me do is to, whenever I find myself experiencing a sense of conflict, I can sit down and say, what is it I desire that I perceive that person as being the obstacle for me to get that? And as soon as I frame it in that way, I often see, well, that is so stupid. They are not the obstacle. Sometimes they can be, But very often we just project our frustration because there's something we want, we aren't getting it, and we've got to blame somebody for that unfulfilled desire. So that's one of the pieces that it helps with. But how that comes into Jesus is the last session.
Let's just skip straight to that.
Any more questions? Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm sure you don't want to get into this, but like for me, my mind keeps going to, well, then where did the desire come from? Like, did God plant this desire inside of us? Because when you think of, I think it's Acts 4 where he says, you know, if you reach out to me and seek me, you'll find me, although I'm not far from any of you,
Yes.
because in you, you know, this whole verse.
Yes.
But sometimes I think, did God just put us down here with unique DNA and say, let's see what this one does? You know, here's a unique DNA, let's see how this works. But is he the one who planted the desire in us that's causing us to interact with other people? And is there like an ultimate, is there an ultimate thing that he wants from us? Or is it just for us to reach out and seek for him and find him?
I think ultimately what God desires for each one of us is for your life to be as meaningful and beautiful and valuable as it can be. I don't think he begins with saying this is the destination. Just like when my son was born, I didn't have a plan to say, you're going to be a videographer and by the age of 30 you're going to live in Kansas City because I want to come visit you. I didn't have that specific plan for him, and I still don't have a plan for where he's going to be in 5 years or 10 years. But my desire is even more than happiness. I think that might be one of the things there, but more than happiness is meaning. I want his life to have meaning, and meaning is found in relationship. I want him to have meaningful relationships, valuable connections, and for me that balance of contrasts is what is defined as beauty. Very often we kind of think beauty is just take all the conflict out of, all the contrast out of it, we don't want complexity, we only want simplicity. We don't want need, we only want provision. We don't want this, we only want... But beauty is that capacity to bring those contrasting aspects of life into harmony. And so to directly answer that question, I'm convinced that God doesn't have one destination, one plan for any of us, but rather he looks at what can be the most beautiful, meaningful, valuable existence that humanity has, and how can you be part of that from where you are. And this is the path that leads us there, and I think God does place before us possibilities, and to whatever extent he can, communicates desires to draw us in that direction. But still in freedom, we have a wide array of possibilities in front of us. And it's not that other people's influence are always evil, drawing me into it. I think very often, I'm first going to go into the negative desire the next time, but there's a positive way in which we influence the desires of one another. There are people in my life that I think, wow, your generosity is a quality I want to imitate. Wow, your friendliness, your patience, there's a positive relationship with imitating the qualities of others where they become exemplars. And I think it's part of God communicating to us the possibilities he sees in our lives. But very often we start from a sense of lack, and we not really have a vision for what is meaningful and beautiful. We just start from how can I protect myself and feel a little bit better than what I'm feeling now. And it's in that position of lack that we misidentify in others the fullness we think we lack. And this happens unconsciously. We don't do this from a decision. We just find ourselves thinking, I want that clothing and that, and I want to do that. But if we sit down and say, where did that idea come from? Very often we'll be horrified to realize, oh, it's because I saw that person do it. Or say that, or whatever. Is that helpful? I think it will become more helpful when we come to the last session.
What about those people that pioneer things, that are the first to run the 4-minute mile? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because somebody had to go first.
Yes, and that's the most difficult.
So they weren't reflecting, or maybe, I don't know, that's what came to my mind. What do you think of that?
Such a good question. I think there we can see a combination of maybe part of what influenced the person who did the 4-minute mile was that he was in relationship with people that inspired him to be athletic. And maybe he was in relationship to people, obviously not breaking the 4-minute mile, but to people who achieved a level of creativity and newness that he didn't see before. So there's partly an influence, but then he did something that's creatively new. Mm-hmm. But I think that creatively new thing was not totally independent from the reflective relationships he was in. Mm-hmm. It is truly new, but it's using those relationships in the most creative way to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's from people telling him he could never do it. So his desire was to go and do it.
Yeah, sometimes.
I'll show you.
Yeah. Sometimes our reflection of others is because we don't want to be like them.
Right.
And that's very often the most difficult relationships to acknowledge. To acknowledge that the person that I don't want to be like has shaped me. In the very fact that I've gone the opposite direction.
And I have them to thank.
And you've got them to thank.
Yeah.
Isn't that a difficult space to be in? Yes.
I think you'll talk about this next, but can you, feel free to defer, but how does this help you? So as we grow, let's just say more like Jesus, but then we're around our friends or family that, don't believe in God. I'm finding this is very helpful to know where I'm actually in conflict. It's like I desire to still be loved by them.
Yes.
But I also desire to be more like Jesus. So how has this helped you understand what you're really frustrated at? Because in my mind, that your desire is actually what's creating the conflict that you're in. So it's like the conflict isn't external, it's internal.
Yeah.
Right? Is that what you're saying?
So you specifically spoke about family or friends that aren't believers. That there can be conflict. I think a lot of unnecessary conflict in those situations comes from this idea that it is our job to convert them and to persuade them.
Right.
And that if we don't, their blood is on our hands.
Right.
And we go about that persuasion very often just in an intellectual way. And I think people intuitively know your agenda. That you're here to just get me on board with your religion or your point of view. I'm going to feel that. So in those circumstances, I first settle it within myself that my desire for this relationship is first and foremost that this is an opportunity for me to love you. I don't care in that context whether you believe what I believe, whether you agree with what I agree. I want to see you first and foremost the way our Abba sees them, and this is an incredibly valuable, beautiful opportunity to love. And that will often open up the opportunities to share further. Obviously, there might be some values that really clash. You know, there might, but I think when you start off with that, this is my approach, then that is a basis for a relationship where you can work around the other values that doesn't harmonize yet. I don't know whether that is the heart of what you were asking. That's kind of part of what I was.
Yeah, I think it answers some of it. I was just saying like even just in normal circumstances where we're constantly being shaped, but then you're maybe even just part of a group of people who are also being shaped, but in a different direction.
Yes.
But your internal desire is still to be accepted into that relationship, right?
Yes.
So I guess what it does for me is it opens up the context that most of the conflict I'm having is internal. It's not an external thing creating in my life. It's just it asks me, or it forces me to ask questions of why am I actually frustrated? Is it that I'm not included in the circle, or is it that I'm mad at them because of their belief systems or their values or whatever?
I think that question is one of the most profound ways to now reevaluate that relationship.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it helps me get way
What
closer
causes
to
that frustration?
the roots, you know, like what really is it, you know?
Yeah.
And most of the time it's going to be in your control to understand that.
Do I see somebody at the back here?
I think, I feel like a question that I've heard oftentimes, or a dialogue that I hear regularly, is this idea of, well, I just want to do whatever God's will is. Like, I don't want to follow my own desires. I want to do whatever God's will is. Something I feel like I hear a lot.
Yeah.
And they'll throw in verses about, not my will, but your will be done, Lord. And I have a feeling you got a little bit of a different take. And I would love, maybe this is for a different session, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
So desire, I think, because it is such a powerful movement, in most religions, they focus on the negative side, including the Jewish and Christian religion. If you go look at texts speaking about desire, it will mostly be warnings. Careful. Like James. It's the reason for all the conflict, all the war, all of that. But at the so it's a capacity, just like the atomic bomb is a capacity for great evil or for great energy that serves a lot of people. I think desire is a capacity that intensifies our capacity for both good and evil. So you'll find a lot of scriptures about watch out, what forms your desire and how it can lead you. But then in Jesus, which is the last session, we suddenly see, especially in the book of John, I love the book of John, the whole book is about how desire shapes us and brings us to a place of contentment. Even the first story, I think it's actually so comical because John and Peter are obviously devout in their religious commitment. They're following John, who's not a popular voice to be followed. And John tells them, that's the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And they immediately, I think, just starts following him, saying, oh, is this the Messiah we've been waiting for? And I'm sure we know they're not really formulating what do we want to ask him, because Jesus suddenly turns around and he says, what do you want? For me, that's such a key phrase, because the first thing that the Word made flesh speaks is a question. And the question is the most profound question. What do you want? But the author of John is a master craftsman, because he puts this whole idea within a comical story, because John and Peter have obviously not thought of a proper question, and they kind of said, where do you stay? I'm sure afterwards they were saying, couldn't you have thought of a better question? What is the where do you stay? And Jesus answers them and he says, come and see. But the whole theme of the Gospel of John is this journey of come and see where I abide. And so we get to John 14, where Jesus says, if you abide in me, my words abide in you, you will desire. And this time, we've just translated it, you'll ask for whatever you want, it will be given to you. We've made it a formula for getting prayer answered. But I think what Jesus is saying is first and foremost, is find a place of contentment. Because part of the perversion of desire happens when it begins in a sense of lack, of being. And you've got to first find this place of abiding in me, this place where you know that what and who you are in this moment is totally loved, embraced, approved, adored by your Creator. If you can find that place of contentment, just stay there. The Greek has got this beautiful sequence. It says, you will desire, you will ask, and it will be created. So out of that place of contentment is birthed desires that are now not shaped just from a sense of inadequacy where I don't know what I want and I look at everybody around me to tell me what I want. It is shaped out of this place of contentment. And you will ask, and it will be created. So Jesus very often said, I don't do anything unless I see my Father doing it. I think there is a place of saying, there are certain desires that I recognize in my life that probably needs transformation because they weren't birthed in that place of contentment. So, yes, there's space for transforming our desires, but then the other side of the coin is the only way in which God wants you to do His will is if you desire it. Who wants an unwilling, obedient servant to just say, okay, whatever I don't like, that's probably God's will. Whatever is not enjoyable is probably His plan. And if I enjoy it, it's most probably the devil.
Yep.
No one wants that kind of relationship. I think God draws us through desire and communicates through desire.
So
Thanks.
You know, I said this one. Oh, sorry. Yeah, let's jump to lunch and we can continue the questions on the next section too. Yeah, so we have like a little sandwich salad bar over there to do what you want. My wife will give you instructions when you get there, but how about that? You get a great discussion and marriage counseling, right? It was good. Now, yeah, we'll pick up the conversation if we need to when we come back, and let's just get everybody fed, and then we'll start the next session in about, let's do like 20 minutes. You can eat during the next session if you want to, but there's food available for you and the bathroom. If you need a cigarette break, you can go downstairs and go outside and do that.
Thank you.
lighter out there if you need it.
So